Hello everybody, welcome to Awesome Rusty Bucket. Subscribe to the channel if you're over on YouTube and give us a like. It helps the video do better in the algorithm, so it's much appreciated. And go ahead and check this out over on Spotify or Apple Podcasts if you want to enjoy this as an audio-only experience. Today we are hitting a classic video format, every NBA team's biggest weakness. Before I get into that, if you are into my old My League content, that channel is active again and it's going to be live streamed from now on. Had a really fun time during my first stream, so if you want to come through to watch those live, that would be great. But if you also just want to watch the edit, that's great as well. That will be linked in the description as well as my Twitch. I'm just going based off of the standings from last year, and I'm going to be going conference by conference. So we're going to start in the West with the Oklahoma City Thunder. The only real major weakness I would say is they don't have any like elite playmakers. I think Shea is fine enough. I think J-Dub is a pretty good functional playmaker, not a great one, but a good one. But there is no like absolute dimer on the team. The fact that that's the weakness that is like the biggest shows that this is a pretty well-rounded team, because for the most part I really don't think this is a major concern. For the Denver Nuggets, this would come as no surprise, but their bench unit is their biggest weakness. Now there is a possibility that some of the younger guys on that bench end up developing and being big for them going forward, but at least right now it does not look like they're going to have a lot of guys to go to off of the bench when they get into a postseason setting. For the Minnesota Timberwolves, I would probably say the consistency of their two main scorers, which is Anthony Edwards and Karl Anthony Towns. Cat especially is bad when it comes to consistency. Like, he'll look good one game in the playoffs and then he'll look very bad another game in the playoffs, and in general just a wishy-washy player. Anthony Edwards, he still has like a little bit of the younger, not as well-equipped version of him that he still sometimes defaults to. Bad habits die hard, you know. But just the fact that there can be nights where both of them, or one of them in a better case, are going to just completely shoot inefficiently out of nowhere, that is a problem, and that is one of the reasons that I do feel like they're the fourth best team in the Western Conference. That can change if Anthony Edwards takes yet another leap, which isn't impossible. For the Los Angeles Clippers, I feel like this team doesn't really have any desire or purpose to it. What are the odds that James Harden and Kawhi Leonard are like super locked in and invested into what's going to happen next season? I really can't see it. I don't imagine that's going to be the case. It kind of feels like this roster is just here because it is. After Paul George left, it was like, well, not that Paul George is like a devastating player to lose for your franchise, but it is enough of a loss that it is like you're not really a contender anymore. Kawhi Leonard in the playoffs can be good enough that he can win you a series against just about anybody, but other than that, they already had this factor to them where they often just felt like an assortment of players rather than a team. Like, you didn't get the impression that they really wanted it, which saying that a team doesn't want it, I think, is often just a lazy excuse for not actually providing real analysis. But in the case of the Clippers, you can analyze them in a way beyond that all you want. The main issue that they had over the past is that they just did not really feel like they were going for it, especially in 2020 when they had their best opportunity and they completely blew it. It's like they fell asleep at the wheel. I'm kind of just waiting for this team to hit the reset button. They're going to be interesting to watch, though. They might actually end up being decent, but I don't really know what the point would be if they were. For the Dallas Mavericks, I'm going to go with the consistency of their outside shooting. Obviously, Klay Thompson being added to the board will probably help with that quite a bit, but PJ Washington, Najee Marshall, they're both guys who have had points where they've looked like good three-point shooters and points where they very much did not, and they're going to be rather integral parts of that rotation. Quentin Grimes, also somebody who shot exceptionally well from three before and then really poorly at other times. So we don't actually really have a full grasp of how capable and how good their three-point shooting is going to be. That was a huge problem for them in the finals. Their three-point shooting was fucking abysmal. Basically, after I think the last game, like game 5, they actually did manage to have a decent percentage, but the 4 games before that, they were like shooting 10% as a team other than Luka Doncic's threes. So yeah, outside shooting, and specifically the consistency of it, is their biggest weakness. For the Phoenix Suns, I'm just going to say defense across the board. Kevin Durant is a pretty good defender. Devin Booker has his moments of being a really good defender, and Royce O'Neal is a solid defender. Other than that, there's really not a lot of strong defensive players on this team. Yusuf Nurkic can occasionally be all right just because he's a really big body. I'm pretty sure they signed Mason Plumlee. He's cool defensively, but Bradley Beal out there, Tyus Jones, both of those guys playing a lot. They're guys who you can very easily target. And for any of the other players in between, like Grayson Allen, there's just not anyone who's that threatening defensively on this team. And like when I say Devin, Kevin, and Royce O'Neal are good defenders, I do not mean they're like, yeah, this player is going to lock up or seriously bother some sort of star player. Really, they're just like not bad matchups, but they're not really all that good of them either. Kevin Durant has some off-ball defense, weak side shot blocking stuff that he brings to the table that's beyond just a one-on-one defense, but other than that, man, like, the defense just sucks, and I don't think it's going to be good. For the New Orleans Pelicans, their issue to me is they are not as good as the sum of their parts. They have a lot of talent on this team, but they don't necessarily mesh all that well. The playmaking is a little bit weird. It's kind of a by committee thing. It doesn't feel like an egalitarian approach like the Boston Celtics have, where like anybody can get the ball at any moment. It just feels like between CJ, Zion, and Brandon Ingram, they just take turns being the only guy who's initiating. Brandon Ingram's not a high volume 3-point shooter, so that doesn't really work. DeJounte Murray is going to be an interesting fit. I honestly have no idea how that's going to go. His three ball has been super inconsistent throughout his career. So the playmaking distribution is weird, and I also think the fit from player to player is weird. Also, having a center who can't shoot. I recognize Alex Hoops actually just made a great video about how hard it is to get the 3-point shooting big man. They desperately need him. Whoever that player may be, they desperately need a 3-point shooting big man. And until they get it, I feel pretty low on them relative to, again, the sum of their parts. They are so talented, but there's structural problems with the team. For the Los Angeles Lakers, their biggest weakness is that their secondary shot creation is divided among multiple mediocre players, mid-ish, better than average players technically, but for being in the shot creator territory, for in the high volume shot creation territory, not the best options. Obviously, the primary two guys for that are D'Angelo Russell and Austin Reeves. Your primary shot creations coming from LeBron and a little bit of Anthony Davis, even though Anthony Davis gets a lot of his offense off of the ball. He does do a lot of creation himself. But when it comes to the shot creation beyond your top two guys, it gets not great and inconsistent, and D'Angelo Russell sucks in the playoffs, and Austin Reeves is cool. He's not as bad or inconsistent as D'Angelo Russell, but it's not that great either. The fact that those two dictate so much of their offense while being so okay kind of puts a cap on their ceiling. For the Sacramento Kings, their biggest issue is they have two non-floor spacers as core starters, with Fox not being a great shooter historically. De'Aaron Fox just had the best 3-point shooting season of his career. His percentage and volume, I believe, were both career highs. However, in general, he's like a 30% 3-point shooter. So there is a serious risk that the Sacramento Kings, if that season was more of a fluke for De'Aaron than it actually was not a fluke, and Fox ends up being a poor 3-point shooter. DeMar obviously is not a good 3-point shooter. Sabonis is not a high volume 3-point shooter at all, even though he's occasionally hit them. That would be a huge hindrance to their offense. And their offense is, of course, the main reason that they have any success to begin with. So if the offense takes a step back, it's not like they're going to make up for it on the defensive end of the floor. So hopefully, you got to pray that De'Aaron Fox's 3-ball stays very good. If anything, you would hope it would improve. But in general, that is something I'm worried about, and I'm curious to see how it works. I think they will be one of the better inside the perimeter teams in the league. The 3-ball might get rough for them. For the Golden State Warriors, shot creation, shot creation, shot creation. It is very easily shot creation that is the biggest problem for this team. Other than Stephen Curry, do not have a real shot creator. Now, I recognize that Jonathan Kuminga scores the ball well enough, but he's not really a you give him the ball and watch him go to work type of guy. A lot of his offense is assisted. A lot of his offense comes in transition. In terms of half-court shot creation, in an isolation or out of a pick and roll or however they try to approach it, out of the post, he's not great at that stuff. And after him, huge fucking plummet. Like, what's next? Like, Andrew Wiggins or Pajimski? Oh man, that's bad. Like, that's very, very bad. There is not enough creation on this team. Stephen Curry kind of has to do all of it. I'm actually going to look up Kuminga's assisted field goal percentage because I am curious how extreme it is. He has 90% of his three-pointers assisted and 61% of his two-pointers assisted. That's a very high number for both of those. So yeah, shot creation is the Warriors' biggest problem. For the Houston Rockets, it's more that they just don't have a clear hierarchy. I'm not actually really sure what this rotation's going to look like. There are a couple of guys who could get in over others. Like, if you told me that Reed Shepherd was a better point guard than Fred VanVleet by the end of the season, I wouldn't be all that shocked. But if you also told me Reed Shepherd was barely a part of the rotation by the end of the season, I also wouldn't be super shocked by that. Jalen Green, he has this stretch at the end of the season a couple of times in his career now, but the last one was especially good. Is he really that player like NBA 2K seems to think he is because he's a fucking 85 overall? Or is he not actually that good? How much is Amin Thompson going to rise? Will Jabari Smith elevate his game a little bit? Will Şengün elevate his game a little bit? And how do those players fit with everybody trying to develop at the same time? They still have vets like Dylan Brooks and Fred, who I previously mentioned. So I'm curious. I'm not sure what this team will look like and the balance of the roster and the hierarchy of the roster. Like, who's the first option? Who's the second option? Who's the third option? That shit is not clear at all. Speaking of lacking in clarity, for the Utah Jazz, they have no clear direction. Now, I'm not someone who's super critical necessarily by default of a team kind of middling, because as long as you're doing internal development and you still have some good assets, I don't hate it universally. But in the case of the Utah Jazz, it's kind of reaching that point where it's like, all right, man, are you going to keep getting like the 7th pick in the draft, or are you going to tank for real? They should trade Lauri Markkanen. I highly doubt they're going to turn this roster into something really good where Lowry can contribute to that by the time, before he's 30 years old. So I would just move him, cash in those assets, do your pretty standard rebuild. I don't really know what they're doing, insisting on being the best of the bad teams. For the Memphis Grizzlies, stability at small forward is their biggest problem. It's either going to be Gigi Jackson or Vince Williams Jr. Gigi is going to be interesting. He's starting the season injured, so he's going to have to acclimate to things after they've already gotten their momentum as a team going through the season. I don't know how that's going to go because he's a young player who scored a lot of points and was pretty impressive in his rookie year, but that was in a dramatically different context than what the Grizzlies are going to be this year. I think Vince Williams could also be cool, but the fact that you really don't know who that player is going to be is concerning to me. I do suppose you could maybe put Marcus Smart in at the 2 and then slide Desmond Bane to the 3. I think Bane can guard most small forwards well enough. Either way, that's the big question mark. Otherwise, they have all the other positions locked in. For the San Antonio Spurs, decision-making from players that are not CP3 and Trey Jones. I would say that Jeremy Sohan is a decent playmaker and that Devin Vassell isn't bad at it, but basically everybody else on this team, I just don't feel good about their ability to put the ball on the floor in any capacity, their ability to make the right pass in any capacity, whether it's their big man, Keldon Johnson specifically, very concerning to me. He's a terrible playmaker. I thought Keldon was going to be pretty good. I was actually pretty high on him, but I recognized eventually is like, man, this is just a shoot first player who isn't that great at shooting. I don't love the decision making outside of those 3 players. Luckily, I think the ball is going to be in one of their hands pretty much all the time. That's the huge benefit of having Chris Paul and Trey Jones, one way or the other, you are going to have a high-level passer on the floor. For the Portland Trailblazers, a similar thing, a similar issue to the Houston Rockets. I'm kind of unclear on their hierarchy, a little unclear on what those teams are actually going to look like. Is Anthony Simons going to be the leader in shots? Is it going to be Jeremy Grant? Are you going to focus more on getting Scoot Henderson further development? What is going to be the exact approach? Another one to throw in there is Shaedon Sharpe, who's one of my favorite young players. Yeah, I just don't really know what that hierarchy is going to look like. Obviously, with a team that's going to be one of the worst teams in the league, there's a lot of weaknesses that are technically probably weaker than that issue. But at least as it pertains, especially to how they're going to proceed going forward, having a clearer hierarchy would really help that. The Boston Celtics' biggest weakness, we're moving on to the Eastern Conference, is they are vulnerable to injury at the 5 position. So Porzingis, pretty injury prone, and then after Al Horford, if Al gets hurt too, or Al can't play big minutes because he's older, and then you have to consistently play serious Xavier Tillman minutes, that would blow. Another team where it shows just how good the team is, that is the biggest concern for them though. For the New York Knicks, ironically a similar issue. Vulnerable to injury at the 5 position. Their starting center is Mitchell Robinson, and Mitchell Robinson has not exactly had a clean bill of health throughout his NBA career. I don't think that he's the greatest starter in the world, even when he is healthy, so the 5 position already not being great. If you're then going to like Jericho Sims, that's rough. Going from Isaiah Hartenstein, Mitchell Robinson as your big men to Jericho Sims and like fucking whoever the hell you'd sign in free agency, or maybe there's some other center on the roster who I'm just blanking on. But yeah, that's the one position to be concerned about with them. For the Milwaukee Bucks, I think their biggest issue is their utilization of Damian Lillard and Giannis. I think the way that they are used in the offense is the biggest fundamental problem with them. I think that Dame can be much better if he is treated as the main ball handler and the main shot creator, and Giannis does less playmaking, does more screening and rolling. Obviously, that's something that he has to develop over time to get better at, but they kind of stopped doing it last year when they realized Giannis was kind of not great at it. That's unacceptable to me. That's a thing that would work well as long as Giannis started figuring out how to roll the basket, figure it out, and use an offense that treats it like he's figured it out, because that's really the only way to get there. For the Cleveland Cavaliers, the spacing is inherently going to be bad with Evan Mobley at the 4. This is another one of those things that's pretty much just the concern that you have about them at large. Like, beyond just what they're going to do this year, the fact that Mobley does not shoot the ball well and Jarrett Allen is a core part of your team, not great. Think they can still be good. They can still be a good regular season team, but I think pretty much every time you get around to the postseason, that is going to spring up as a huge issue that holds you back from being better. For the Philadelphia 76ers, they don't have many defenders. What I mean by that is like dudes who really lock up consistently. Paul George is very capable of being a good defender even at this stage of his career, but it's not something that he really puts all his energy into anymore like he used to in the past, like back in 2018 when he was 3rd in Defensive Player of the Year voting. I think Caleb Martin is probably the best candidate to be that type of guy if you need it, but I don't think you necessarily need to have a super lockdown option in order to win a championship, in order to be a contender. But the fact that they don't have like anybody where I'm like, yeah, fucking throw that guy into a one-on-one matchup and he kills. Also, a huge oversight here, just for what it's worth. Joel Embiid is a huge deterrent. A huge rim deterrent, ends up being a pretty good defender. I do think some people overrate him defensively, but as a general thing, he's a good defender. And that will overall keep Philly as a decent defense. As it relates to perimeter defense, that's more what I'm focused on. And I don't know. I just don't know if there's a lot of guys on this team who are going to be bothersome to any perimeter player in the East or the West. For the Indiana Pacers, Tyrese Halliburton's inconsistent aggressiveness as a scorer. His scoring makes his playmaking better, so when he is scoring the ball more, the offense in general is a lot better. His playmaking gets better. There's a lot more created opportunities rather than just getting a system offense type of assist, if you know what I mean. And I feel like his inconsistency with his aggressiveness was the biggest issue for them in this postseason. He was dealing with some injury stuff, to be fair. He needs to be better about that. I think he can be a better scorer than he seems to think he can be. The Orlando Magic, the three-point shooting is bad pretty much across the board. Paolo is a decent volume, decent percentage guy. Franz shot horribly from outside. Jalen Suggs, he shot well from three, so he's not really too much of a concern. Also, Jonathan Isaac is a pretty core part of that team, can't really shoot all that well. They've added KCP, which is nice, but he's not like a high volume guy. You gotta hope that Franz can bounce back as a shooter. You gotta hope that Paolo takes a leap in his third year. He improved dramatically from his rookie year, so it makes sense if he would get better even more. Three-point shooting will be their downfall. For the Miami Heat, I have determined that I think Jimmy Butler's indifference to the regular season is actually their biggest problem. Pat Riley seems to agree as well because he was kind of taking shots at him. I don't feel like Miami gets the right momentum and is not in the right spot, like mentally, going into the playoffs as they used to be. I feel like that's largely because their leader just doesn't really care until they get to that moment. And obviously they've just flipped that switch before in the past, but really didn't look like it was going to happen last year. And then of course it didn't. And I don't know, if it wasn't going to happen last year and it wasn't going to happen the other two times they made the finals, I really don't think it's going to happen in general. For the Chicago Bulls, they essentially have a whole roster of question marks. Like everybody on this team, it's a little unclear how good they actually are. Josh Giddey, Ayo Dosunmu, Kobe White, Patrick Williams, Matas Buzelis, all of these guys could go either way. So I think that will determine a lot if they end up being the worst of the worst teams or one of the better of the bad teams. For the Atlanta Hawks, there is not much significant secondary shot creation / scoring next to Trae Young. And I specifically say next to Trae Young because Bojan Bogdanovic, I actually think is one of the most underrated players in the league, but he can't necessarily play a lot of overlapping minutes with Trae because they're both defensive liabilities and you can only really afford one of those at a time. Jalen Johnson is a pretty decent scorer, and I would not be surprised if he was in the 20-point per game mark next season. That's not really going to be coming from a shot creating type of angle. So I don't know how that's going to look for them. The Toronto Raptors, their biggest issue is they might be a little too good to tank with the best of the teams that are going to be tanking. They actually have a decent chunk of NBA talent. The Raptors have generally employed a more retool rather than rebuild approach. So I don't know if they're necessarily all that upset with the fact that they would probably be one of the better of the bad teams, but it could hold them back from getting a genuinely good draft prospect. For the Charlotte Hornets, LaMelo Ball's ankles, the moment he has a healthy season, I think they'll be a playoff team in the West, or at least a play-in team in the West and in the East. For the Wizards, Jordan Poole and Kyle Kuzma are your top two scoring options. That's enough said. For the Detroit Pistons, lots of non-3-point threat perimeter players. I don't even know if I really agree with that. Jaden Ivey is one. Not really high three-point volume from Tobias Harris either, even though he is not a terrible three-point shooter. Cade Cunningham, I don't know that he's a great three-point shooter. They did improve their shooting as a whole, though. I don't know. Their biggest weakness after that is probably some level of shot creation beyond Cade Cunningham, because Jaden Ivey had a decent rookie year. Marcus Sasser, is that the name of the point guard on the Pistons who can shot create? Whatever. I don't know. That wasn't a great answer, but I can't figure it out right now and I have to go. So shout out to Nick for editing this video, and that is it. Goodbye.